I never thought a grain silo would become the hill I'd die on. But here I was, staring down the barrel of a lawsuit from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association over a structure that was about to become their greatest accidental ally. My name is Xavier Pemberton, and I'd moved to this planned community outside Des Moines, Iowa 6 months ago, with dreams of finally living the rural lifestyle I'd always wanted while still being close enough to the city for work. The property was perfect, sitting on 2 acres at the edge of the development, zoned for agricultural use because the developers had carved it out of old farmland. I worked as an agricultural consultant, and the grain silo wasn't just decorative. I actually used it for storing feed and seed samples for my clients throughout the Midwest. The silo itself was a beauty, 70 feet of galvanized steel that caught the morning sun like a beacon. I'd had it installed 3 months ago, following every regulation in the book. County permits, structural engineering reports, the works. What I hadn't counted on was Barbara Whitmore, the HOA president, whose dedication to maintaining property values bordered on religious fervor. The first notice came on a Tuesday. I found it tucked into my mailbox, printed on cream-colored letterhead with the HOA logo embossed at the top. Notice of violation. Unapproved structure exceeding height restrictions. My heart sank as I read through the legalese. According to Barbara's interpretation of the covenants, no structure could exceed 35 feet without board approval. My silo was exactly double that. I called the number listed at the bottom, and Barbara answered on the first ring. Meadowbrook Heights HOA, Barbara speaking. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Xavier Pemberton from 47A2 Prairie View Lane. I just received your notice about my grain silo. Mr. Pemberton. Yes, we need to discuss your flagrant violation of our community standards. Her voice had that particular tone that middle-aged suburban women perfect over years of returning slightly expired yogurt and demanding to speak to managers. With all due respect, I checked the covenants before installation. My property is zoned agricultural. The county approved everything. County zoning and HOA regulations are 2 separate matters, Mr. Pemberton. I suggest you review Section 4.7 of your covenant agreement. You have 30 days to remove the structure or face daily fines of $500. $500 a day? That's insane. The silo cost $40,000 to install. Then you should have thought about that before building it. Good day. She hung up. I spent that evening poring over every page of the HOA documents I'd signed at closing. There it was, buried in subsection after subsection. Height restrictions. But my lawyer instincts kicked in. I'd been a paralegal before switching to agricultural consulting, and something didn't add up. The restriction referenced residential structures specifically. My silo was agricultural, on agriculturally zoned land. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. I marked my calendar and started preparing my defense. Thursday came faster than I wanted. The community center was one of those generic multi-purpose rooms with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that hummed like angry bees. About 30 residents had shown up, most of them looking bored until Barbara called the meeting to order. She sat at a folding table up front, flanked by 2 other board members, Richard Chen, the treasurer, and Patricia Morrison, the secretary. Barbara wore a pantsuit that screamed, "I'd like to speak to your manager," and had her hair in that distinctive angled bob that seemed to be standard issue for HOA presidents nationwide. First order of business, Barbara announced, consulting her papers. The unauthorized grain silo at 4782 Prairie View Lane. All eyes turned to me. I stood up, holding my folder of documents. I'd like to address the board about this. Barbara's smile was thin. The time for addressing this was before construction, Mr. Pemberton. I disagree. My property is zoned agricultural. The silo is an agricultural structure. Your height restriction specifically mentions residential structures. Any structure that can be seen from neighboring properties must comply with our aesthetic standards. Barbara countered. Then I'd like to formally request approval from the board as the covenant allows. Barbara exchanged glances with Richard and Patricia. Very well, we'll take it under consideration. You'll have our decision in writing. I sat down, feeling like I'd just put a tiny crack in her armor. Over the next week, I noticed something strange. My cell phone reception, which had been spotty since moving in, suddenly seemed perfect when I was near the silo. I'd mentioned the poor reception to my neighbor, Tom Fletcher, a retired engineer who lived 3 houses down. Count yourself lucky with that silo, Tom said one Saturday while I was checking my mail. Rest of us have been fighting with our phones for 2 years. 2 years? What happened? Verizon put up a cell tower about a mile south of here. Things powerful enough to reach downtown Des Moines, but the signal bounces weird off all these houses. Creates dead zones everywhere. Barbara's been leading a campaign to get it removed. Says it's ugly and a health hazard. A light bulb went off in my head. Tom, have you ever noticed if your reception is better near my place? He pulled out his phone, checked the bars. Huh. Yeah, actually, 4 bars here. I barely get 2 at my house. I went home and started researching. Turns out, Large metal structures like grain silos can act as passive reflectors for radio waves, including cell signals. If positioned correctly, they could redirect and amplify signals that would otherwise bounce ineffectively. My silo, sitting at the edge of the development at 70 feet tall, was perfectly positioned to catch the tower's signal and reflect it across Meadowbrook Heights. The formal denial came Monday morning. Request for height variance denied. Structure removal deadline remains in effect. 27 days remaining. That afternoon I got my first visitor. Helen Cruz, an elderly woman from 2 streets over, knocked on my door holding a plate of cookies. "Mr. Pemberton, I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what, Mrs. Krause?" "My daughter lives in California. We video chat every Sunday, but for 2 years the connection kept dropping. Last 3 weeks? Perfect. Crystal clear. My son-in-law is a cell phone technician. He says something must have changed with the signal distribution." She smiled knowingly. "He mentioned it's probably that new tall structure on this side of the neighborhood." I accepted the cookies, my mind racing. "Mrs. Krause, how many people do you think have noticed better reception lately?" "Oh, quite a few. We were talking about it at book club. Everyone's noticed." An idea formed. A wonderfully petty, perfectly logical idea. I spent the next 2 days going door to door on the streets nearest my property. Out of 43 houses, 38 residents confirmed significantly improved cell reception in the past 3 months. I documented everything, had them sign statements, checked their phone providers. The data was clear. My silo was acting as a signal reflector, solving a problem that had plagued the neighborhood since the tower went up. The HOA's next community meeting was in 2 weeks. I used every day to build my case. I contacted a radio frequency engineer from Iowa State University, Dr. Michael Stevens, who agreed to do a signal analysis. His findings were even better than I'd hoped. "Your silo is functioning as a passive repeater," he explained over the phone. "The tower's signal hits it at an angle and reflects across the development. Without it, the signal either overshoots the area or gets absorbed by the buildings. It's actually an elegant accident of physics. Can you put that in a report?" "Already done. Sending it over now." I also dug into the HOA's campaign against the cell tower. Barbara had filed 3 formal complaints with the FCC, started a petition with 200 signatures, and even hired a lawyer to explore legal options. All of it public record, all of it showing how desperately she wanted that tower gone. The irony was delicious. 2 days before the meeting, I received another notice. Final warning, 15 days until fines commence. $500 DA for non-compliance. I didn't respond. I was too busy preparing my presentation. The meeting room was packed. Word had gotten around that there was going to be drama over the grain silo. Barbara looked pleased as she called the meeting to order, probably expecting to publicly shame me into submission. "Mr. Pemberton, you have 15 days to remove your structure. Do you have anything to say?" I stood up with my laptop and projector. "Actually, yes. I'd like to present new information to the board and the community." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a debate. According to Section 12.3 of the governing documents, any homeowner facing fines has the right to present their case to the full community before penalties are enforced." Richard Chen leaned over and whispered something to Barbara. She pursed her lips. "Fine. 5 minutes. I'll need 10, 5, then I'll speak quickly." I set up my presentation. The first slide showed a map of the neighborhood with cell signal strength overlaid in colors. Red for poor, yellow for moderate, green for good. The entire development was yellow and red. This is the cell coverage in Meadowbrook Heights as of 4 months ago, before my silo was installed. As many of you know, reception has been poor since the Verizon tower was activated 2 years ago. Heads nodded throughout the room. Barbara's expression soured. Next slide. The same map, but now with large patches of green radiating from my property. This is current coverage. Notice the improvement? That's because my grain silo is acting as a passive radio frequency reflector, bouncing the cell tower signal across the neighborhood. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Barbara stood up. "This is irrelevant to the covenant violation. Actually, it's entirely relevant, because the board has been trying to remove that cell tower for 2 years. I clicked to the next slide showing Barbara's FCC complaints. These are public record. The board president has filed multiple complaints citing poor service quality and aesthetic concerns. "Those complaints are about health and safety," Barbara snapped. "Really? Because these emails suggest otherwise." Next slide. Screenshots of community forum posts I'd found, where Barbara had complained extensively about dropped calls and slow data speeds. The tower's not going anywhere. The FCC already ruled on it. But my silo solves the exact problem you've been complaining about. I could see people pulling out their phones, checking their signal bars, comparing notes with their neighbors. The energy in the room was shifting. Dr. Stevens' report came up next. I walked them through the technical details in layman's terms. The silo's height and position created an optimal reflection angle. Its cylindrical shape distributed the signal evenly. Removing it would immediately return the neighborhood to poor coverage. I've collected signed statements from 38 households confirming improved reception since the silo was installed. That's roughly 40% of the development. Tom Fletcher stood up from the back. He's right, my reception's been great for the first time in 2 years. Helen Krause raised her hand. Mine too. I can actually use my phone in my backyard now. More voices joined in. Barbara's face was turning red. This doesn't change the fact that it violates our height restrictions, she said loudly. Restrictions on residential structures, I countered. My property is zoned agricultural. The county confirmed this. I have permits proving the silo is legal under county and state regulations. The HOA covenant doesn't override county zoning. Our lawyers disagree. Then let's talk about selective enforcement. I'd saved this for last. Section 8. 2 of the covenants prohibits any structure that creates a nuisance or diminishes property values. I'd argue that poor cell reception diminishes property values more than a grain silo, especially since the silo is on agricultural land at the edge of the development, while poor cell coverage affects every single property. Patricia Morrison, the secretary, spoke up for the first time. He has a point, Barbara. Whose side are you on? Barbara hissed. I'm on the side of my phone actually working. I've missed 3 important calls from my son because of dead zones. The room erupted in discussion. People were arguing, some for the silo, some against. Barbara tried to regain control, banging her gavel repeatedly. Order. We need order. Richard Chen was studying his phone, walking around the room, checking signal strength. He came back to the table looking thoughtful. Barbara, I think we need to table this discussion. There are clearly factors we didn't consider. We are not tabling anything. The violation stands. I move to table the enforcement action pending further review, Richard said formally. I second, Patricia added. Barbara looked betrayed. You can't be serious. All in favor? Richard called. A forest of hands went up. Barbara's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Motion carries, Richard declared. Mr. Pemberton, the enforcement action is suspended for 60 days while we review. I nodded, trying not to smile too widely. Thank you. The meeting dissolved into chaos. People crowded around me, asking questions about the silo, thanking me for improving their reception. Barbara gathered her things and stormed out, Patricia hurrying after her. Tom Fletcher clapped me on the shoulder. Well played, son. It's not over yet, I said. She's not going to let this go. I was right. Over the next week, Barbara went on the offensive. She sent emails to every homeowner claiming the silo was a safety hazard, an eyesore, and potentially causing health problems from directed radiation. She cited debunked studies about cell phone signals and started a new petition to remove both the tower and my silo. She also tried going over the board's head, filing a complaint with the county claiming I'd misrepresented my land use. The county inspector showed up on a Tuesday morning. His name was Gary Mills, a weathered man in his 50s who'd clearly seen every kind of zoning dispute imaginable. Mr. Pemberton, need to inspect your grain silo. Of course, everything should be in order. He spent an hour checking the structure, reviewing my permits, measuring setbacks from property lines, and examining the foundation. Who filed the complaint? I asked. HOA president. Says you're running a commercial grain operation without proper permits. I'm an agricultural consultant. I store samples for testing. No different than keeping tools in a shed. Gary nodded. That's what I figured. Your permits are solid. This is clearly residential agricultural use, well within zoning parameters. He closed his clipboard. I'll file my report. You're in compliance. Thanks, Gary. Word of advice? HOA disputes get ugly. Document everything. I was already doing that, but I appreciated the warning. Barbara's next move came from a different angle entirely. She contacted my employer, Midwest Agricultural Consulting, and filed a complaint claiming I was creating a nuisance that reflected poorly on the company. My boss, Jennifer Holbrook, called me into her office that Friday. Xavier, what's going on with your HOA? I explained the situation. Jennifer listened, her expression unreadable. So your grain silo is actually helping your neighbors? Yes, significantly. And it's properly permitted? Completely. She leaned back in her chair. Then tell Barbara Whitmore if she contacts this office again with frivolous complaints. We'll consider it harassment and respond accordingly. Your personal property dispute has nothing to do with your work here, which has been exemplary. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. That said, Xavier, be careful. HOA disputes can escalate quickly. I've seen them ruin people. She wasn't wrong. The next escalation came in the form of a lawsuit. Barbara, acting as HOA president, filed suit in Polk County District Court seeking an injunction to force removal of the silo and damages for diminished property values and aesthetic harm. The complaint was 30 pages of legal theatrics, but the core claim was simple. My silo violated the covenants, and no amount of incidental benefit to cell reception mattered. I hired a lawyer, Marcus Webb, who specialized in property and zoning law. He was a sharp guy in his early 40s with a reputation for eating HOAs for breakfast. This is actually a strong case for you, Marcus said, reviewing the documents in his office. Agricultural exemptions are pretty ironclad in Iowa, especially with county approval. The HOA is on shaky ground. What about the height restriction? Ambiguous at best. The covenant language is vague enough that we can argue multiple interpretations. Plus, we have the selective enforcement angle. When's the last time the HO measured every structure in the development? No idea. Exactly. I guarantee there are sheds, flagpoles, and antennas that violate various restrictions. They're targeting you specifically, which could be considered discriminatory enforcement. We filed our response, including a counterclaim for legal fees and harassment. The discovery process began, and Marcus requested every HOA enforcement action for the past 5 years. What we found was damning. Barbara had filed 17 violations in her 2-year tenure as president. 16 had been resolved with warnings or minor fines. Only mine had escalated to lawsuit threats and massive daily fines. More importantly, 3 properties had structures exceeding 35 feet, decorative cupolas, and a communication antenna that had never been cited. Marcus filed a motion to dismiss based on selective enforcement. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was fracturing. A group of residents who loved their improved cell reception started a counter-petition supporting the silo. Helen Krause spearheaded it, gathering 73 signatures. They presented it at the next HOA meeting. Barbara refused to acknowledge it. Petitions from residents don't override legal covenants. Neither does your personal vendetta, Tom Fletcher shot back. The meeting devolved into shouting. Richard Chen finally called for a vote of no confidence in Barbara's leadership. She stared at him in shock. "You're joking. I'm completely serious. Your handling of this situation has been extreme and divisive. I move for a vote." Patricia seconded immediately. The vote was called. Out of the 27 residents present, 19 voted for the motion. Barbara's leadership was officially in question. She stood up, shaking with rage. "Fine, you want to run this association into the ground? Be my guests." She grabbed her belongings and left. Richard assumed temporary leadership. His first act was to call me. "Xavier, can we talk? Off the record?" We met at a coffee shop in West Des Moines. Richard looked exhausted. "I want to resolve this," he said. "Barbara's lawsuit is draining our HOA reserves and it's tearing the community apart." "I'm willing to discuss reasonable solutions," I said carefully. "What if we formally approved the silo, but you agreed to some aesthetic modifications? Paint it to match the surroundings, maybe add some landscaping?" "I can work with that. The silo's already silver, which blends with the sky. I could add trees around the base to soften the visual impact from the street. And if future residents complain, we document the cell reception benefit. Make it part of the community selling points. Best cell coverage in Des Moines suburbs sounds pretty good." Richard smiled for the first time. "It does, doesn't it?" We shook hands. He promised to present the compromise to the board. Barbara found out and went nuclear. She sent a mass email to every homeowner claiming Richard was conspiring with me, that property values would plummet, that the HOA was betraying its fundamental purpose. She threatened to sue the board members personally. That's when things got really interesting. Tom Fletcher, the retired engineer, did some digging into HOA finances as a concerned resident. What he found made my grain silo seem like a minor issue. Barbara had been spending HOA funds without board approval. Major expenditures for her anti-cell tower campaign, including legal fees, had come from association reserves without the required votes. Tom presented his findings at an emergency board meeting. The numbers were stark. Over $22,000 spent without authorization over 18 months. Richard Chen went pale. "We need to bring in an auditor." "Already contacted one," Tom said. "She can start next week." Barbara showed up to that meeting with her own lawyer, a slick-looking guy named Douglas Hart who specialized in HOA law. "My client has authority to spend up to $5,000 per incident without board approval per Section 15.4 of the bylaws," Hart argued. "These aren't incidents, they're an ongoing campaign," Patricia countered, "and several individual expenses exceed $5,000. Immaterial." The board gave tacit approval by not objecting when monthly financial reports were distributed. "We never saw itemized reports," Richard said, "just summary numbers." The audit took 3 weeks. The auditor, Catherine Myers, was thorough and unforgiving. Her report was devastating. Barbara had indeed exceeded her authority repeatedly. Worse, she'd misclassified expenses to hide them in budget categories that didn't require board approval. Legal fees for her personal campaign against the cell tower were listed as community maintenance. A $4,000 payment to an anti-5G consultant was marked as health and safety assessment. The total unauthorized spending was $38,000. The board had an emergency session. I wasn't there, but Tom filled me in later. They voted to remove Barbara as president immediately, banned her from holding any board position, and they're considering whether to file criminal charges for embezzlement. Will they? Richard's hesitant. Says it would be bad for property values to have that kind of publicity. But Patricia's pushing for it, says letting it slide sets a terrible precedent. The next day, Barbara showed up at my door. She looked terrible, hair disheveled, eyes red from crying. "This is your fault," she said. "I just wanted to keep my grain silo. You destroyed me. The board, the audit, everything. You manipulated everyone with your cell phone tricks. I presented facts. The silo helps people. You spent HOA money illegally. Those are separate issues. I was protecting property values. That tower is dangerous. The radiation, the ugly equipment, all of it. I was fighting for this community. You were fighting for yourself, your crusade, your control. Nobody elected you dictator." Her face crumpled. "I'm probably going to jail. That's between you and the board. I didn't make you misuse funds." She left without another word. I felt a twinge of sympathy, but only a twinge. She'd tried to destroy me over a silo, dragged me into court, contacted my employer. Whatever consequences came were of her own making. The board voted to file charges. Not embezzlement, which would have been hard to prove, but fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The Polk County District Attorney's Office took the case seriously. Apparently, HOA fraud was becoming a bigger problem in Iowa, and they wanted to make an example. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb filed a motion to dismiss Barbara's lawsuit against me, arguing that she'd filed it without proper board authorization as part of her pattern of exceeding authority. The judge agreed. The suit was dismissed with prejudice, and the HOA was ordered to pay my legal fees, which totaled $18,000. The board, now led by Richard, with new members elected in an emergency vote, formally approved my grain silo. They also adopted new rules requiring board approval for any enforcement action involving fines over $100 per day. I painted the silo a soft sage green that blended better with the landscape and planted a row of fast-growing poplar trees around the base. The compromise looked good and the cell reception remained excellent. Barbara's criminal case had took 6 months to wind through the system. Her lawyer negotiated a plea deal, restitution of the full $38,000, 2 years probation, and a ban from serving on any HOA board in Iowa for 10 years. She avoided jail time, but her reputation was destroyed. She put her house up for sale 3 weeks after sentencing. I saw her one last time as the moving truck pulled away. She didn't look at me. Life in Meadowbrook Heights settled into a new normal. The cell reception became a genuine selling point. 2 houses sold in the 6 months after the silo was approved, both to buyers who specifically mentioned the excellent coverage as a factor. Helen Krause started a neighborhood watch that actually focused on community building instead of covenant enforcement. Tom Fletcher got elected to the board and pushed through reforms that made the whole system more transparent and less prone to abuse. I continued my work as an agricultural consultant, and the silo remained exactly what I'd built it for. A functional structure for my professional needs that happened to have excellent side benefits. One Saturday morning, about a year after the whole mess started, I was doing maintenance on the silo when a Tesla pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 30s got out, looking professional in business casual clothes. "Mr. Pemberton, I'm Emily Kane from the Des Moines Register. I'm writing a piece about HOA governance reforms in Iowa, and your case came up repeatedly in my research." "Really? Your situation highlighted a lot of problems with HOA oversight. The state legislature is considering new regulations based partly on what happened here." We talked for an hour. She was particularly interested in how the cell reception angle had turned community opinion and how the financial audit had revealed systemic problems. "What would you say to other homeowners facing aggressive HOA enforcement?" she asked. "Document everything. Know your rights under both HOA covenants and county zoning. And don't be afraid to push back when enforcement is selective or excessive. HOAs have power, but they're not above the law." The article ran 2 weeks later, front page of the Metro section. It detailed Barbara's fall, the embezzlement case, and the broader issues with HOA governance in Iowa. My grain silo was featured prominently, including an aerial photo showing how it towered over the neighborhood. The state legislation passed 4 months later. The new law required annual independent audits for HOAs over a certain size, limited daily fines to $250 without court approval, and created an appeal process for homeowners facing enforcement actions. I framed the article and hung it in my office right next to my agricultural consulting certifications. A reminder that sometimes standing your ground leads to bigger changes than you expected. The silo still stands at 70 feet, catching the morning light and bouncing cell signals across Meadowbrook Heights. My property value actually increased according to the latest assessment, partly due to the agricultural exemption tax benefits and partly because people liked living near reliable cell coverage. I ran into Richard Chen at the grocery store one afternoon. We'd become friendly after everything settled down. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Barbara was so obsessed with getting that cell tower removed. If she'd just left your silo alone, she might have actually had a case. The tower company was considering relocating based on all the complaints. But once your silo fixed the reception problems, all those complaints dried up. The tower's staying permanently now. I laughed. So by trying to remove my silo, she guaranteed the tower would stay? Exactly, the irony is beautiful. We parted ways and I drove home past the rows of nearly identical houses, each one getting 4 or 5 bars of perfect cell reception thanks to 70 feet of galvanized steel that caught radio waves and sent them bouncing across the subdivision. Sometimes the best revenge is just being right. The following spring, I got a call from a homeowner in a development outside Cedar Rapids. He'd read the article and was facing a similar situation with his HOA over a ham radio tower. Any advice? He asked. Yeah. Get everything in writing, know your zoning rights, and find out if your structure is solving a problem your neighbors didn't know they had, he laughed. That's specific advice I've got a specific experience. Word spread. I became an unofficial consultant for homeowners fighting HOA overreach across Iowa and even neighboring states. I didn't charge anything, just shared what I'd learned and connected people with good lawyers like Marcus Webb. The grain silo became a landmark. People giving directions would say, "Turn left at the big green silo." Delivery drivers used it as a navigation point. Kids in the neighborhood used it as a reference point for boundaries in their games. One family asked if they could use it as a backdrop for their Christmas card photo. I said yes. The picture was beautiful. The silo decorated with a massive wreath at the base, snow falling against the green metal, their kids laughing in the foreground. They sent me a copy, and I put it on my refrigerator. That's when I realized the silo had become more than a functional structure or a symbol of legal victory. It had become part of the community identity. The thing Barbara had wanted to erase had instead become something that defined us. 2 years after the initial violation notice, I threw a neighborhood barbecue. Over 100 people showed up, bringing food and drinks, letting their kids run around my property. We set up tables in the shadow of the silo, and people took turns sharing their favorite moments from the whole saga. Tom Fletcher told the story of Barbara's face when the signal strength maps were revealed. Helen Krause described organizing the counter petition. Patricia Morrison shared about standing up to Barbara at that crucial board meeting. Richard Chen gave a toast to Xavier, who taught us that sometimes the thing that looks wrong is actually exactly what we need. Everyone raised their glasses. I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for the fight, but for what came after. The community was stronger now, more engaged, more willing to question authority and think critically. As the sun set behind the silo, casting long shadows across the gathering, I thought about Barbara. I hoped she'd found peace wherever she'd moved. The anger and obsession that had consumed her hadn't been healthy for anyone, least of all herself. The next board election saw record turnout. People who'd never cared about HOA governance were suddenly paying attention, asking questions, demanding transparency. The new board adopted policies that balance property standards with individual rights, focusing on genuine quality of life issues rather than petty enforcement. My grain silo stood as a silent reminder of what happens when bureaucratic overreach meets determined resistance. But more than that, it stood as proof that sometimes accidents of physics can solve problems better than deliberate planning. The cell tower company actually reached out to me once, curious about the signal improvement their monitoring had detected. I explained the silo's reflective properties. Their engineer was fascinated. "You've basically created a passive repeater without meaning to," he said. "We've been trying to solve signal distribution in planned communities for years. This is an elegant solution we never considered." "Feel free to use the idea elsewhere," I said. "We might. Though I doubt many developments have 70-foot grain silos their loss." Life moved forward. I dated occasionally, threw myself into my consulting work, and maintained my silo with the kind of care usually reserved for vintage cars. It became a point of pride. Keeping it clean and well-maintained, the paint fresh, the mechanism smooth. On the 3rd anniversary of the violation notice, I climbed to the top for an inspection and maintenance check. From 70 feet up, I could see the entire development spread out below, houses in neat rows, parks and playgrounds, the community center where so many dramatic meetings had unfolded. My phone buzzed. 5 bars. Perfect reception. I took a picture of the view and posted it to the neighborhood social media group with the caption, "Best view in Meadowbrook Heights." 43 likes and counting within minutes. Comments rolled in thanking me for the silo, sharing stories of important calls that didn't drop, video chats with distant grandchildren that stayed crystal clear, work from home days that actually worked. Helen Krause commented, "That silo is the best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood, and I'll fight anyone who says different." Tom Fletcher replied, "Helen's 78 and fierce. Nobody's fighting her." I climbed down, feeling the satisfaction of something well-built and properly used. The silo would outlast me, probably outlast the houses around it. Grain silos were built to last, galvanized steel designed to withstand decades of Iowa weather. Future homeowners would benefit from the cell reception without knowing the fight it took to keep the source standing. Future boards would hopefully remember the lessons learned about overreach and accountability. And somewhere in some database, my case would exist as precedent for the next person who needed it. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the silo in shades of orange and gold. A car pulled up and Marcus Webb got out grinning. "Thought you'd want to see this." He handed me a legal magazine. "Your case got written up in the Iowa Bar Association Journal. They're using it as a teaching example for property law." I flipped through the article. It was thorough, detailing the legal strategies, the zoning arguments, the selective enforcement angle. My name was there, along with Barbara's, part of legal history now. "How does it feel to be famous in property law circles?" Marcus asked. "Weird, good weird. You helped change some bad laws and expose corruption. That's more than most people accomplish with lawsuits." After he left, I read the article fully. It was strange seeing the whole saga laid out in academic legal language, stripped of emotion and context. But the core truth remained. Overreach had been challenged, accountability had been enforced, and reasonable compromise had prevailed. My phone rang. It was Jennifer from work. "Xavier, I've got a potential client who specifically asked for you. They read about your zoning expertise in the Des Moines Register article." "The grain silo thing?" "Yep. Turns out standing up to an HOA is good for business." "Who knew?" I laughed. "Send them my contact info." The client led to 2 more, then 5, then a steady stream. My consulting practice expanded beyond agricultural work into property rights and zoning consulting. I helped farmers navigate suburban encroachment issues, rural landowners facing development pressure, and homeowners dealing with restrictive covenants. The grain silo had changed my career in ways I never expected. 5 years after installation, I refinanced my house. The appraiser walked the property with professional detachment until we reached the silo. "This is an interesting feature," he said. "Agricultural exemption, functional use, and I see in my notes it provides cell signal benefits to the surrounding area." "That's correct. That's actually adding value. Properties with utility to neighbors tend to appraise higher. Plus, the ag exemption reduces your tax burden, which makes the overall property more attractive." My home value had increased 32%, well above neighborhood averages. When the appraisal came back, I sent a copy to Richard Chen with a note. "Thought the board might appreciate seeing this. Turns out the silo increased property values after all." He replied within an hour, "Barbara would have a stroke if she saw this." Proof that being right matters more than being loud. I framed that email too. The years rolled on. Meadowbrook Heights matured from a new development into an established community. The trees grew taller, families came and went, children grew up and moved away. Through it all, the grain silo stood constant. Barbara's lawsuit had been dismissed, her criminal case closed, her house sold. But the changes she'd inadvertently triggered by targeting my silo rippled forward. The HOA remained transparent and accountable. State regulations protected homeowners from similar overreach. And the community understood that sometimes the unconventional solution is the right one. I eventually started dating someone seriously, a woman named Rachel who worked as an urban planner. When I told her the grain silo story on our 3rd date, she laughed so hard she cried. "You accidentally solved a radio frequency problem while fighting an HOA? That's the most engineer thing I've ever heard." "I'm not an engineer, you are in spirit." She moved in 2 years later. The silo didn't bother her at all. In fact, she loved it. "It's unique," she said. "Every other house here looks the same, but we've got character." She started a garden around the base, planting vegetables and flowers that thrived in the reflected morning light off the metal surface. The visual impact softened even more. The industrial structure framed by living greenery, new families moved in, most of them young professionals who worked from home. The cell reception was no longer a nice bonus, it was essential infrastructure. They needed reliable connections for video conferences, cloud services, and streaming. My silo provided, nobody questioned it anymore. It was just part of the landscape, as natural as the stop signs and streetlights. One Saturday, I gave a tour to a local high school civics class studying local government. Their teacher, Ms. Peterson, had read about my case and thought it would be educational. 20 teenagers clustered around as I explained HOA governance, property rights, and civil resistance. "So you just refused to back down?" one kid asked. I backed up my refusal with facts and legal precedent. "Stubbornness alone wouldn't have worked." "But you could have lost everything," another said. "I could have. But I knew I was right and I had proof. That combination is powerful." They climbed the silo in small groups, supervised and harnessed for safety. From the top, they could see their school, their neighborhoods, the city skyline in the distance. I showed them the cell tower to the south, explained the physics of signal reflection. "So this whole fight happened because nobody understood physics?" one girl asked. "Partly. Also because someone in power didn't like being questioned." Ms. Peterson nodded approvingly. "And what's the lesson here?" Question authority when it's wrong, I said. But bring receipts. The class visited on a Friday. By Monday, I had emails from 3 parents thanking me for the tour and the civics lesson. One mentioned their teenager had been struggling with standing up to bullying and found my story inspiring. I hadn't thought of my grain silo fight as inspiring. It had felt like survival, like protecting what was mine. But I supposed from outside it could look different, could look brave. The neighborhood kids started using the silo for school projects. Science reports on radio waves, civics presentations on local government, even an art project that involved photographing the silo in different seasons and lights. I said yes to all of it. The silo had become a community resource in ways that had nothing to do with grain storage. 10 years after installation, I decided to host another barbecue, this one specifically commemorating the anniversary. We called it Silo Fest and made it an annual tradition. 200 people showed up. We had food trucks, a band, activities for kids. Local politicians came, including a state representative who'd sponsored the HOA reform legislation. Your case started a movement, she told me. We've had significant reform across Iowa because you stood your ground. I just wanted to keep my silo. And in doing so, you protected thousands of other homeowners from similar overreach. That matters. As the sun set on Silo Fest, I stood at the base of my 70-foot tower of galvanized steel and reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. A simple agricultural structure had become a symbol, a landmark, a catalyst for change. Barbara Whitmore had tried to tear it down and in doing so had torn down the very culture of unchecked HOA power she represented. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't involved so much pain and conflict, but the outcome was undeniable. The community was better. The laws were better, and my cell phone reception was excellent. Rachel came up beside me, slipping her hand into mine. What are you thinking about? About how things work out in unexpected ways? Your silo, everything. The fight, the outcome, all of it. I built it to store grain samples. It became a cell tower reflector, a legal precedent, a community landmark. I never intended any of that. The best things are usually unintended, she said. Music drifted across the lawn, kids played in the gathering twilight. Adults laughed and talked around scattered tables. Above it all, the silo stood tall, painted sage green, catching the last rays of sunlight. I'd come to Meadowbrook Heights wanting a quiet life close to the land while maintaining my city career. Instead, I'd gotten a legal battle, public attention, and unexpected influence on state law. But I'd also gained community, purpose, and the satisfaction of being undeniably, provably right. The grain silo would stand for decades more, long after I was gone. It would continue reflecting cell signals, storing the occasional grain sample, and reminding people that sometimes the things we fight hardest to remove are exactly what we need most. And somewhere I hoped someone else facing HOA overreach would hear my story and find the courage to stand their ground. Armed with facts, determination, and maybe a little bit of accidental physics, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I pulled Rachel closer and watched my community celebrate around a structure that had almost been torn down. Barbara had wanted it gone to protect property values and maintain control. Instead, its presence had increased values and redistributed power. Sometimes justice isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just a grain silo standing exactly where it should be, doing exactly what it was meant to do, plus a whole lot more that nobody expected. I raised my glass to the silo, to community, to the strange paths that lead us home. The metal surface gleamed in the festival lights, a beacon of persistence and unexpected victory standing 70 feet tall against the Iowa sky.